George Clooney, a name etched into the backbone of Hollywood itself, a silhouette that never faded, only grew sharper as the years moved on. He didn't simply rise into fame. He arrived with a kind of command people don't learn from. Lessons they're born from it, carved through it, and hardened by it. For decades, the world watched that unmistakable presence, the composed stare, the clean lines of his face, the salt and pepper hair that became a symbol of effortless masculine grace. Time didn't dull him, time refined him. On screen he carried the electricity of someone you couldn't ignore even if you tried. As Dr. Doug Ross on Eye High, he didn't just earn attention, he branded himself into the memory of a generation. And from that moment on, every role that followed felt like a continuation of a legend being written in real time. He proved again and again he was never only the handsome one. He became the benchmark, the image of the last true gentleman of the modern era, built from sharp intellect, charm that never looked forced, and a calm control that made every room feel smaller around him. But behind the velvet curtains of premieres, behind the flashes, the headlines, the flawless smile that never seemed to crack, a harsher truth always waits. What if the man the world called untouchable spent much of his life locked inside pain that never announced itself? What if the cost of greatness wasn't only pressure, but suffering so relentless that money, fame, even love couldn't silence it? Before we go deeper, take a moment to honor George Clooney, not just for what he gave the screen, but for the strength he carried when nobody was watching. Comment or write Rip George Clooney to honor them. Nina. Bruce brought a kind of polish to the family name, a former beauty queen, a woman shaped by public life and poised strength. There's a weight that comes with being raised by someone who knows how the world looks at you, how the world measures you, and that kind of upbringing can feel like protection, until life proves that protection isn't the same as peace. Comment or write Rip Nina Bruce to honor them. Nick Clooney stood on the other side of that spotlight, a respected television host, a journalist, a voice that carried credibility. When your father is known, you grow up understanding something early. Visibility is not always chosen. Sometimes it's inherited, sometimes it's assigned, sometimes it follows you before you even know what you want your life to be. Comment or write Rip Nick Clooney to honor them. Rosemary Clooney wasn't just family, she was already legend. A name that carried its own echoes, its own legacy, its own history inside American culture. Having an aunt like that means your last name walks into rooms before you do. And from the outside, it looks like destiny has already been arranged. Comment or write Rip Rosemary Clooney to honor them. Even Abraham Lincoln appears in the distant threads of that lineage, not as a daily reality, but as a reminder that some families carry the weight of history in their bloodline, whether they ask for it or not. To outsiders, it all looked like a guarantee, a childhood surrounded by names and respect, a future cushioned by recognition. But fate doesn't care what things look like from the outside. Fate always chooses the moment that cuts the deepest. Comment or write Rip Abraham Lincoln to honor them. Music. George Clooney wasn't born already standing in the light people later imagined around him. Long before he became shorthand for confidence and cinematic authority, he was only a boy facing fear, at the age when safety is supposed to feel natural. Born on May 6, 1961, he entered a life that seemed promising, almost protected. And yet, even the most promising beginnings can hide the quiet arrival of pain. Pain doesn't always come roaring in. Sometimes it enters softly, early, uninvited, and it sits beside a child like an unwanted shadow, making them wonder if the world will ever see them the same way again. At 13, he was pulled into a trial that no award could ever erase. Bell's palsy, sudden, cruel, and deeply personal, took hold of the left side of his face for nearly 9 months. One eye refused to close. One side of his mouth stopped obeying him. For a boy stepping into adolescence, it wasn't just a condition, it was exposure. It was being placed in front of the world before you've learned how to hold yourself steady. It was vulnerability without permission. Years later, he would speak about it like it was nothing. A shrug, a faint smile, a practiced ease. But the boy inside that story remembered everything. He remembered the mirror feeling like a stranger. He remembered the way silence in a hallway could turn into cruelty without anyone saying a word. He remembered the looks that lasted too long, the laughter that landed like a blade. Some wounds aren't loud, they're repetitive. They teach you to brace yourself long before anyone knows you're bracing, and in those classrooms, in those corridors, in the long humiliating hours of trying to act normal while feeling anything but normal, he learned a survival trick that would follow him into adulthood. If he laughed first, he could steal the weapon from someone else's hands. If he turned pain into comedy, he could control the room before the room controlled him. Humor became armor, not because he was carefree, because he was defending himself. The charm people would later adore wasn't born from comfort. It was manufactured under pressure, refined out of necessity. A shield polished until it looked like confidence. When the paralysis finally faded, the mask didn't disappear with. It stayed. It became part of the machinery that helped him move forward. So George chased motion. He chased proof. He chased the feeling of being capable again. Sports gave him that language. Basketball, baseball, effort, sweat, a scoreboard that didn't care about your face, only about what you could do. He even earned a tryout with the Cincinnati Reds in 1977, a door that briefly opened just enough to let help rush in before it closed again when he was cut in the first round. No grand goodbye, no ceremony, just rejection. And he kept going anyway. After high school, work was simply work, wherever it existed, however hard it was. Cutting tobacco under the Kentucky sun, selling insurance door to door, stocking shelves, living through long days that offered no applause and no promise. Those years weren't glamorous. They weren't designed for storytelling, but they built the foundation of the man people would later call unstoppable, because resilience isn't always dramatic. Sometimes it looks like waking up and trying again. Sometimes it looks like swallowing disappointment and refusing to let it become your identity. When the world finally embraced him as Dr. Doug Ross, audiences saw ease, warmth, confidence, that effortless glow of a man who seemed born for the spotlight. But what the world couldn't see was the scar tissue beneath it. The hidden architecture of someone who learned early that you could be judged for things you never chose. Someone who learned how to absorb laughter and keep walking. Someone who learned how to survive rejection without surrendering belief. Is why when George Clooney stands celebrated today, composed, honored, admired, you are not only looking at a star, you're looking at a survivor, a reminder that strength isn't the absence of pain. It's the discipline of carrying pain and still building a life anyway. Comment or write "Rape George Clooney" to honor them before the world knew him by name. He moved through Hollywood like a ghost, another hungry actor with a familiar surname, but no guarantees and no special protection. His early path wasn't paved with applause. It was measured in empty rooms, rejected auditions, short-lived roles, and pilots that vanished before anyone even noticed. From his first appearance in the 1978 miniseries Centennial to fleeting parts, scattered across shows like The Facts of Life, Baby Talk, and Bodies of Evidence. He lived at the edges of an industry that hadn't yet decided he mattered. He drifted from opportunity to opportunity, wearing rejection like a second skin. Sometimes sleeping in friends' closets just to remain close enough to hope, Those seasons strip people down. They erase fantasy. They reveal what you're made of when the world isn't clapping. He learned that talent without endurance is nothing. Hollywood didn't invite him in. He stayed anyway, step after step. Even when leaving would have saved him the humiliation. By the early 1990s, the pressure narrowed. Chances thinned. Patience wore down. Belief became fragile. He later admitted he was nearly out of options, nearly out of money, nearly out of faith. And then, in 1994, everything turned. Dr. Doug Ross on NBC's I arrived like a lifeline. A character built with intelligence, volatility, and wounded compassion. Someone audiences couldn't look away from, and suddenly George Clooney didn't just become liked. He became unavoidable. Overnight, the nameless struggler became the face of primetime television. And even as success finally arrived, fear didn't vanish. Because visibility brings its own danger. When you're seen, you can fall in public. When you're adored, you're also watched. He took risks anyway. Sometimes they hit, sometimes they failed loudly. But every misstep sharpened him, taught him what not to be, taught him what kind of career he wanted to build. And by the time Ocean's 11 arrived in 2001, it felt less like luck and more like destiny catching up. The perfect fusion of charisma and command, a franchise that sealed him into the elite tier of Hollywood myth. But he never stayed satisfied with being admired without depth. He leaned towards stories with weight, films that carried questions instead of noise. In Syriana, Michael Clayton, Good Night and Good Luck, and The Ides of March, he revealed a deeper need, not just to entertain, but to speak with conscience. Behind the camera, he co-founded Smokehouse Pictures with Grant Heslov, building a space for stories that mattered, even when they made people uncomfortable. Recognition followed slowly with the kind of gravity that can't be bought. Academy Awards, global respect, a reputation for being more than a movie star. He became a storyteller, a presence, a moral force inside an industry that often rewards emptiness. But surviving the climb doesn't mean the battles end. Sometimes the hardest moments arrive after you've already made it. Sometimes success is not the finish line, it's the place where life tests you in newer, crueler ways. Comment or rate Rip Grant Heslov to honor them. Asterisk, asterisk. For a man who spent years mastering the art of leaving first, it took one meeting to undo the entire script he'd written for his own heart. Not a grand entrance, not a stage moment designed for cameras, just a quiet evening, a mutual friend, and a conversation that lingered long after the room went silent. In 2013, at his villa on Lake Como, George Clooney met Amal Alamuddin, and from the beginning, she moved through his world like someone who did not belong to it. Not because she was out of place, but because she refused to be shaped by it. She wasn't from Hollywood. She didn't orbit celebrity like a planet pulled by gravity. Amal spoke with precision, with moral weight, with a kind of clarity that made even a man as confident as Clooney pause. War crimes, justice, international law, the pieces of the world most people look away from. She walked directly toward them. What unsettled him wasn't only her intelligence. It wasn't only her presence. It was her complete refusal to be impressed by the myth of him. She met him not as an icon, not as a brand, but as a man. And in that simple shift, in being treated as human instead of legendary, something inside him cracked open. Later, with a rare softness, he admitted he didn't realize how incomplete his life felt until she arrived in it. The kind of truth you don't say unless you've lived with the opposite for a long time. After that night, it wasn't fireworks. It was something quieter and stronger. Emails, thoughtful exchanges, a measured rhythm of getting to know each other without trying to win. And slowly, the walls he'd built over 2 decades began to weaken, not with force, But with trust, the man who once saw romance as something to escape gracefully found himself waiting, rereading messages, shifting priorities, feeling maybe for the first time that closeness didn't threaten freedom. It completed it. Comment or write Rip Amo Alamuddin to honor them. Months passed, and the thing he once swore he'd never do began to feel not only possible, but necessary. He bought a ring. Not for spectacle, not for headlines, not for some manufactured fairy tale, because the thought of a future without her suddenly felt unbearable. One evening, in the stillness of his home, George Clooney went down on one knee. No crowd, no stage. Only a candle burning in the quiet, and a man holding his breath against a lifetime of doubt. And when the silence stretched, long enough to make panic bloom, it carried everything he'd ever feared, repeating old heartbreak, losing what he learned to protect, trusting someone enough to let them hold the parts of him that weren't polished. But she didn't turn away. She said yes. And in that moment, hope returned, not the temporary hope of a successful film or another bright award season, but something steadier, something rooted in trust, built to last. He wasn't only choosing love, he was choosing vulnerability. Comment or write Rip George Clooney to honor them. On September 27th, 2014, Venice witnessed the transformation the world had doubted it would ever see. The city of water and old stone, of moonlit canals and quiet echoes, became the setting where the most famous bachelor of Hollywood finally stopped running. Inside the Amen Canal, Grand Venice, a 16th century palace looking out over the drifting glow of the canals, George Clooney married Amo, not as an icon claiming a prize, but as a man humbled by the discovery that forever could be real. Amo arrived in a flowing Oscar de la Renta gown, radiant without needing to prove anything. Composed, unshaken, a presence built from substance, not performance. Clooney wore a classic Giorgio Armani tuxedo, and for all his confidence, he couldn't hide the awe in his eyes. Two worlds gathered in that room. Hollywood names and familiar faces beside diplomats, advocates, people whose lives were shaped by causes rather than cameras. It wasn't only a celebration. It was a collision of worlds, and somehow it fit. And when Walter Veltroni officiated, the ceremony unfolded with a quiet reverence that felt almost sacred. Not loud declarations, not theatrical vows, but words spoken with sincerity that trembled just enough to remind everyone this was real. To the world. It was the wedding of the decade. To George Clooney. It was something far more private. The day he accepted that peace doesn't always live in independence. Sometimes peace is shared. Sometimes peace is choosing to stay. Comment or write Rip Oscar de la Renta to honor them. Comment or write Rip Giorgio Armani to honor them. Comment or write R.I.P. Walter Veltroni to honor them. But marriage isn't made of candlelight alone. It's built in the quieter days that come after the celebration ends, when the headlines move on and the work begins. When Venice faded into memory, George and Amal Clooney stepped into the far less glamorous reality of building a life together. A life split between continents, between responsibilities, between the kind of schedules that pull at a relationship like weather pulling at stone. George remained connected to Hollywood, films, premieres, travel, commitments that never truly stopped demanding attention. Amal continued her high-stakes legal work across London and Europe, facing governments, war crimes, the darkest corners of global power, with a calm determination that didn't bend for anyone. The distance wasn't romantic. It was physical, constant. Flights at strange hours, missed calls, hotel rooms that felt too quiet. And from the beginning, they made a vow that would test them again and again. Never to spend more than 1 week apart, not a promise meant for interviews. A promise meant for survival, It required sacrifice. It required rearranging ambition. It required choosing each other even when life pulled hard in opposite directions. George began selecting projects more carefully, stepping back when necessary, guarding time at home with the seriousness he'd never shown in his earlier years. Amal, carrying the weight of the world in her work, still made space for the life they were building, not because it was easy, but because it mattered. They built sanctuaries, Lake Como, Los Angeles, an estate in England, not as symbols of status, but as anchors. Places meant to hold them steady when the outside world wouldn't stop moving, and still, the strain never vanished. Amal's work still carried her into rooms filled with human suffering and brutal truth. George, surrounded by fame, admitted there were moments when loneliness could still pierce. What held them together wasn't fantasy, it was choice. The decision again and again to stay Dot by 2024, that decision was tested under public scrutiny. As George prepared for his Broadway debut in Good Night and Good Luck, he lived in New York while Amal remained in Europe with their children. The distance ignited speculation, whispers of separation, rumors of a massive divorce, endless noise, from strangers who mistook distance for collapse. But George shut it down with quiet firmness. The love remained. The respect remained. The partnership remained, because extraordinary lives don't erase ordinary struggles. And what they had was not a fairy tale. It was something braver. Two people who knew solitude, who understood loss, choosing partnership anyway. Comment or write rip them all. Clooney to honor them. Dot. Then came the moment that rearranged everything. Dot at 56. An age when many men settle into routine and predictability. George Clooney became a father. Dot in June 2017. He and Amal welcomed twins, Ella Clooney and Alexander Clooney, at St. Mary's Hospital in London. And suddenly, the life he'd built around independence, around control, around moving freely through the world, shifted into something else entirely. He once admitted he never truly pictured himself as a father, not because he didn't believe in it, but because he couldn't imagine it belonging to him. And then the children arrived, and imagination became reality in an instant. Red carpets gave way to lullabies. Late nights became early mornings. The loudest moments of his day were no longer applause. They were small voices, small footsteps. The ordinary chaos that makes life feel real. Dot independence softened to humility. The kind you learn in diapers and sleepless nights. The kind you learn when love becomes responsibility. Dot. And when Alexander was diagnosed with asthma, fear entered the house like a cold wind. One night during the pandemic, the home went nearly silent except for the sound of a small, strained rhythm. George sat outside the nursery counting breaths, bargaining with nothing but time. They locked down completely to protect him. They cooked together, built pillow forts, played board games. The world shrank to the size of their family, and within that smaller world, George found something he'd been searching for without knowing it. He said it changes you, that you stop thinking about yourself. Every choice becomes about them. Terrifying and beautiful. He jokes about being the oldest father in the room, but his eyes betray the truth. He's grateful. He's stunned. He's humbled. And in those quiet moments, bedtime stories, shared laughter, ordinary routines, George Clooney found a legacy deeper than awards could ever measure. Comment or write R.I.P. Ella Clooney to honor them. Comment or write rip Alexander Clooney to honor them. Asterisk today, at 65 years old, George Clooney stands in a place few ever reach, not just in fame, but in the rare balance between achievement and meaning. He is no longer only the face of Hollywood charisma. He is the outcome of decades spent surviving rejection, surviving pressure, surviving pain, and still choosing to evolve. The world sees the finished image, the steady gaze, the refined voice, the polished confidence that seems effortless. But nothing about his life was effortless. It was built slowly, deliberately, over years when no one was clapping. Years when the doors stayed shut. Years when the only thing that kept him moving was stubborn belief and the will to endure one more day without proof that it would ever pay off. His success became undeniable, creatively, financially, and culturally. His estimated net worth has long been discussed in numbers so large they almost lose meaning when spoken aloud. The kind of figure that feels impossible when you remember where he began, sleeping in closets, scraping together rent, absorbing failure without knowing if there would ever be a break. And what makes the story striking isn't the wealth itself. It's what it represents, because the foundation was acting, yes, but the multiplication came from patience, from timing, from intelligent risk-taking, from refusing to spend a lifetime only being the guy on screen. He became something more expansive, a builder, a strategist, a man who understood that fame can disappear, but what you create beyond fame is what survives. Comment 65 or write Rip George Clooney to honor them. Music. In 2017, one moment became a defining symbol of that transformation. Casamigos, the tequila brand George Clooney co-founded simply for personal enjoyment with friends, was sold in a deal valued at to $1 billion. It wasn't born out of desperation. It wasn't crafted as a corporate machine from the start. It was created out of authenticity, the kind of idea that begins as something real and personal, and only later turns into something massive because it resonates beyond its origin. By most accounts, Clooney personally earned hundreds of millions from that sale, and the scale of it feels staggering, almost surreal, but the deeper meaning sits underneath the headline. Because in that number lives a story Hollywood doesn't always tell, that slow success can become the strongest success, that climbing steadily, learning carefully, and staying consistent through invisible years creates a kind of security that sudden fame alone can't provide. A man who once wondered if he'd ever be invited inside the industry's gates had turned persistence and good judgment into generational wealth. And yet, even then, the story doesn't land as a flex. It lands as a reflection, a reminder that what you build after you make it often matters just as much as what you build on the way there. Comment 65 or write Rip George Clooney to honor them. Music. At wealth for Clooney is visible in the map of the life he's chosen to protect, not a chaotic display of excess, but a collection of sanctuaries meant for privacy, calm, and belonging. At the emotional center of that life is Villa Oleandra on Italy's Lake Como, the historic estate he purchased in the early 2000s. For years, it has felt inseparable from his public image. Not because it is flashy, but because it represents something he lacked for so long. Stillness. A place where the noise of the world can't reach him as easily. A place where he can step out of the role and return to the man. Terrace gardens. Water views, a quiet dock. The kind of setting where the days move slower, where time feels less like something chasing you and more like something you're finally allowed to hold. In England, he and Amal built another refuge, a renovated estate in Berkshire designed not for spectacle but for family life, warmth over shine, privacy over performance, the kind of home that protects children from the storm of fame and lets them grow up hearing more laughter than headlines. In Los Angeles, he remains anchored close enough to the industry without being swallowed by it. And in New York, a residence supports creative work, stage commitments, and the kind of projects that ask more of him than fame ever did. Each place serves a purpose, not trophies, not proof. Anchors. Because there comes a point in life when a person stops collecting status and starts collecting peace. Comment 65 or write Rip George Clooney to honor them. Music. Even the way he approaches personal passions tells the same story: curiosity over indulgence, interest over excess. His vehicle collection has never felt like a loud statement, more like a reflection of a mind that enjoys fascination, classic American cars, motorcycles, even unconventional choices like the ultra-narrow Tango T600 electric vehicle he once owned simply because it intrigued him. Not everything in his life is symbolic, of course. Some things are simply enjoyed. But even enjoyment, in his case, carries a kind of restraint, because Clooney has always seemed to understand something many learn too late. Possessions can comfort you, but they cannot complete you. They can make life easier, but they cannot make life meaningful. Meaning comes from something else. Meaning comes from what you protect. Meaning comes from what you choose. Meaning comes from who you love. Comment 65 or write. R.I.P. George Clooney to honor them. Music, more revealing than any property. Any number, any purchase is how George Clooney chooses to live now. He remains active, still acting, still directing, still producing, but with sharper discernment. He gravitates towards stories with weight, stories that ask moral questions instead of chasing empty spectacle. He doesn't move like a man desperate to be seen anymore. He moves like a man who knows exactly what matters and what doesn't. And alongside them all, he has placed his influence where he believes it belongs, into purpose, into service, into the work of confronting injustice rather than escaping the world's problems. Together, they co-lead the Clooney Foundation for Justice, directing tens of millions of dollars toward defending human rights, protecting journalists, and holding power accountable across the globe. It's not the kind of work that produces instant applause. It's the kind of work that demands commitment when cameras aren't around. The kind of work that costs time, energy, comfort, and in the way they live it, and the way they show up, there's a quiet message. Money doesn't become meaningful until it reduces someone else's suffering. Influence doesn't become valuable until it is used responsibly. Comment or write Rip 'em all Clooney to honor them. Music at home. The most valuable investment in Clooney's life isn't a house or a brand or a career milestone. It's the people who turned his world inside out and made him grateful for that. Transformation. Ella and Alexander Clooney changed him in the way children change people for real, not as a cute storyline, but as a total restructuring of priorities. He schedules work around school calendars now. He treasures ordinary routines. He finds joy in the quiet life that fame never truly provided. The man once known for independence now measures his days in bedtime stories, shared meals, small laughter moving through halls that used to be silent. It isn't glamorous, it isn't public. It's real. And it is here, far from applause, that the transformation feels complete, because the truth is, George Clooney's life today isn't a victory lap, it's an accounting. A long, honest reckoning of what lasts when the noise fades. From near anonymous struggle to global recognition. From emotional distance to the grounding force of family. From wealth earned, wealth shared. From living for achievement to living for meaning. His story offers a lesson the world forgets too easily. Success isn't the finish line. Success is the test that comes afterward. Talent may open doors, but character decides what happens once you walk through them. Money can buy comfort, but only purpose gives it meaning. Fame amplifies who you already are, but it cannot tell you who to become. The most important choices aren't made under bright lights. They're made in silence. When it would be easier to protect yourself than to grow. When shortcuts tempt you. When loneliness offers you the illusion of safety. And George Clooney, in all his complicated humanity, reminds us that the strongest legacies are rarely built from applause. They're built from integrity, from service, from choosing family, from using influence not to escape life, but to meet it fully. Comment 65 or write Rip George Clooney to honor them. Comment or write Ella Clooney to honor them. Comment or write Rip Alexander Clooney to honor them. Asterisk. There is a strange moment that comes for every public figure who survives long enough to become permanent. A moment when the world stops seeing the person as human and begins seeing them as a symbol, a landmark, a headline that never really fades. George Clooney reached that moment years ago, and yet the deeper story has never been the fame. The deeper story has always been what he carried beneath it, the quiet endurance, the private battles, the steady pressure of living inside an image. The world refuses to let soften, because when people speak of him, they speak of the confidence first. The charm, the effortless calm, a kind of presence that makes a room feel stable. But confidence, real confidence, is not always something you're born with. Sometimes it's something you assemble slowly, piece by piece, after life takes. Something from you early. Sometimes it's a structure you build so carefully that even you forget it was ever fragile. And for Clooney, fragility arrived young. It arrived in a body that refused to behave the way a young boy's body should. It arrived in the uncomfortable spotlight of being noticed for the wrong reason. It arrived in the moment you realize people can be cruel, simply because you're different. That kind of experience does something to you. It doesn't disappear when the condition fades. It doesn't vanish when the face returns to normal. It leaves an imprint. It teaches you to stay sharp, to stay funny, to stay ahead of pain before pain finds you again. So the world met the finished version, the polished one, and called it natural. But the truth is, nothing about survival is natural. Survival is chosen. Comment 65 or write Rape George Clooney to honor them. When he finally broke through, the breakthrough looked like destiny, like Hollywood had always planned to crown him. But anyone who has lived through rejection understands the reality. It never feels inevitable while you're inside it. It feels like walking through doors that slam shut. It feels like being invisible for years and wondering whether your life is passing without you. It feels like going home after auditions, after failed pilots, after the industry shrugs and moves on, and still waking up the next day to try again anyway. That kind of persistence doesn't make you softer. It makes you sharper. It makes you appreciate every inch of ground you earn. It makes you understand that applause is never guaranteed. It's borrowed, temporary, and it can disappear as quickly as it arrives. So when ER gave him a face the world couldn't forget, it didn't just give him success. It gave him survival. It gave him a chance to turn years of failure into something purposeful. And still, even then, the story didn't become simple, because fame is not peace. Fame is volume. Fame is exposure. Fame is pressure disguised as celebration. The world looks at the spotlight and sees warmth. The person standing inside it often feels heat. Comment 65 or write Rip George Clooney to honor them. And then came the kind of pain no fan could see. The kind of pain that doesn't show up in photographs. The kind of pain that makes you realize how quickly life can strip you down to the basics. Can you sit? Can you stand? Can you breathe without bracing? Can you make it through one more hour without breaking? That spinal injury during Syriana wasn't a dramatic Hollywood anecdote. It was a turning point. It was a private war fought behind closed doors while the world still expected him to show up shining. There is a loneliness in that kind of suffering. Not because you're alone physically, but because no one can truly feel what you feel. People can sympathize, but your pain is yours. You carry it inside your own skin. And that is when the myth of being untouchable dies. In that space, you learn what matters. You learn what doesn't. You learn the limit of money and the limit of praise. You learn that the human body does not respect reputation. If you survive it, you don't come back the same. You come back awake. Comment 65 or write George Clooney. to honor them, but even physical pain, as brutal as it can be, is still something the mind tries to solve. Something you try to outlast, something you try to treat. Grief is different. Grief doesn't negotiate. It doesn't offer a finish line. It doesn't care how resilient you've been before. It arrives and changes the air in the room forever, losing. Adelia Ada Zeidler at 65 wasn't a chapter Clooney could rewrite with strength or charm. It wasn't a problem he could fix with discipline. It was simply loss, complete and final, leaving him with the emptiness of knowing someone who has always existed in your world is suddenly no longer there. And when a sibling is gone, something in the structure of your life shifts, because they weren't only part of your present, they were part of your origin. They were the last remaining proof of who you used to be before the world interfered. That is why grief like this is so heavy. It's not only missing them, it's missing the version of yourself that existed when they were still here. Comment 65 or write R.I.P. Adelia Ada Zeidler to honor them. Then, as if life wanted to remind him that even the strongest people are still human, love returned not as fantasy, but as something real enough to demand courage, because falling in love again after heartbreak is not romantic the way movies make it seem. It is terrifying. It is stepping into fire, knowing what it can do to you. It is trusting someone with the parts of you that still hurt. Amal Alamuddin entered his life like an answer he didn't know he was asking for. Not because she saved him, but because she met him beyond the performance, beyond the charm, beyond the image. And sometimes that is the most healing thing of all. Being seen as human again. Their marriage wasn't a perfect dream. It was a choice, a discipline, a partnership that demanded effort, schedules, distance, sacrifice, public scrutiny, but it held. And what they built together wasn't only a love story. It was a new life. A life that proved that the man who swore he'd never risk forever again was capable of it. Once he found a forever worth the risk. Comment or write Rip Amal Alamuddin to honor them. Comment or write R.I.P. Amal Clooney to honor them. And then, as if the universe wanted to reshape him one final time, fatherhood arrived. Ella and Alexander Clooney didn't just add joy to his life. They changed the meaning of everything in it. Because children don't care about your awards. They don't care about your net worth. They don't care about your reputation. They care if you show up, They care if you're present. They care if you listen. And that is the most honest test of a person. Not who they are when the world is clapping, but who they are when a child needs comfort in the middle of the night. His world became smaller in the best way, more grounded, more real. He learned that fear can live right beside love, especially when your child is vulnerable, especially when asthma turns a quiet night into a moment you'll never forget. And yet, even fear became a teacher. It made him grateful. It made him protective. It made him present in ways fame never required. Because when you become responsible for someone's life, you stop living only for yourself. Comment or write Rip Ella Clooney to honor them. Comment or write Rip Alexander Clooney to honor them. Now, looking at George Clooney's life from the outside, people will always list the accomplishments first. The roles, the awards, the wealth, the properties, the power, the influence, but the legacy isn't only what he achieved. The legacy is how he changed. The legacy is how he endured. The legacy is how he learned that achievement without meaning is hollow, that success without belonging echoes, that fame without purpose is just noise. He didn't just rise. He evolved. He matured into the kind of figure who understands that life isn't a straight climb upward. It's a series of losses and recoveries, a series of doors opening and closing, a series of moments where you either become bitter or you become deeper, Clooney became deeper, and that is why his story still matters, not because it is flawless, but because it is human dot, because beneath the icon is the boy who once didn't recognize his own reflection. Beneath the star is the man who once slept in closets and tried again anyway. Beneath the applause is someone who has known pain, heartbreak, fear, grief, and still chose to keep living forward dot in the end. That is what people remember. Not only what you did, but what you carried. Not only what you achieved, but what you became. Comment 65 or write Rip George Clooney to honor them. There are stories that feel like they belong to everyone, not because the person was perfect, but because the journey was recognizable, because the triumphs were visible and the scars were quietly familiar. George Clooney's life has never been just a reel of highlights. It has been a long passage through pressure, reinvention, loss, and the constant demand to keep going even when the world can't see what it costs. Some people become famous and remain frozen in a single image, a single decade, a single performance. Clooney didn't. He moved through eras the way certain rare names do, steadily, convincingly, with the kind of longevity that only comes from discipline and deep instinct. He became a leading man without becoming hollow. He became admired without becoming distant. And through every reinvention, there remained something grounded beneath the polish, something human that never quite left the frame. That humanity is what audiences kept returning to. Not only the presence, but the sense that there was a person behind it. Someone who had been shaped by something heavier than applause. Someone who understood that confidence isn't always something you feel. Sometimes it's something you perform until it becomes real enough to carry you through the day. Comment 65 or write Rip George Clooney to honor them, because the truth is, George Clooney learned early that life can change your face, change your footing, change the way you walk into a room. Bell's palsy didn't just touch his body, it touched his sense of safety. It introduced him to a kind of vulnerability most people don't face at 13, the fear of being stared at, the fear of being reduced to what's wrong with you, the fear of being laughed at for something you didn't choose. And when the condition faded, what remained wasn't simply relief. What remained was a new instinct: protect yourself. Stay sharp, stay funny. Stay one step ahead of pain. That instinct followed him into adulthood. It lived underneath the charm the world admired. It was the reason he could disarm a room with humor, why he could hold attention without seeming to beg for it. The audience called it effortless. But effort was written into every layer of it. Survival teaches you how to control the narrative before someone else does. Comment 65 or write R.I.P. George Clooney to honor them. Then came the years Hollywood rarely celebrates, the invisible years. The years when a person is not yet a star, not yet secure, not yet certain they will ever matter. The years when you are simply trying to remain close enough to the dream that it doesn't die. It's easy for people to look back now and call his rise inevitable. But there is nothing inevitable about rejection. There is nothing inevitable about sleeping in closets just to stay near auditions. There's nothing inevitable about getting small roles that vanish as quickly as they arrive and still believing you might be capable of more. That belief is not glamorous. It's exhausting. It requires a kind of stubbornness that borders on madness, the willingness to keep stepping forward. When the world has given you no proof you should didn't make him strong. It revealed the strength that was already there. It placed him where the world could finally see what years of endurance had built, and in that breakthrough was a quiet truth. The victories people celebrate are often the ones paid for in private. Comment 65 or write Rip George Clooney to honor them. But if early struggle taught him endurance, later life taught him fragility. Not emotional fragility, physical fragility. The kind that humbles even the most powerful person. because it is not negotiable. The injury during Syriana was one of those moments that changes a person's relationship with their own body. It isn't simply pain, it's betrayal. It's realizing that the thing you rely on, your health, your strength, your ability to function, can vanish in an instant, and when pain becomes relentless, it shrinks the world. It turns days into survival. It turns nights into calculation. It forces you to measure your life not by what you want to do, but by what you can endure. People often imagine fame as protection, but pain teaches the opposite. Pain teaches equality. Pain teaches that no amount of admiration can stop suffering from reaching you. What it can do sometimes is change what you value. It can strip away what doesn't matter and leave you facing what does. And Clooney, in the quiet aftermath of that ordeal, leaned harder toward purpose, toward meaning beyond performance, toward the kind of influence that isn't measured in box office numbers but in impact. Comment 65 are right. R.I.P. George Clooney to honor them. And still, even physical pain, as isolating as it is something the mind can imagine surviving. The body can heal. The nerves can settle. Life can, in time, become manageable again. Grief does not offer that bargain. Grief does not heal in the same way. It transforms. It rearranges. It does not shrink until it disappears. It grows quieter. Maybe, but it stays. It becomes part of the shape of your life. Losing Adelia Ada Zeidler at 65 was not a moment Clooney could outwork. Not a moment he could charm his way through. Not a moment that could be solved by money or status. It was absence, complete and permanent. A sibling loss is a particular kind of sorrow. It is losing someone who held your beginning in their memory. Someone who knew you before you were edited into a public figure. Someone who could look at you and still see the boy you used to be, not the icon the world insists you are. That kind of loss leaves you standing in a strange silence. A silence where the past suddenly feels farther away because the person who shared it is no longer here to confirm it. And when Clooney spoke of her bravery, of her humor, of her dignity, it wasn't performance. It was love. It was a brother trying to honor someone who carried strength in a way the world never fully got to witness. Comment 65 or write Berdelia Ada Zeidler to honor them. Music, love, too, leaves its marks. Sometimes love teaches you tenderness. Sometimes it teaches you caution. Sometimes it teaches you that being admired is easier than being known. His marriage to Talia Balsam was part of that education. A chapter written before he had fully become himself, before he understood what he needed, before he knew how to protect the relationship from the hunger of ambition. It ended. And endings don't always look dramatic. Some endings look like silence, growing over time, like distance that becomes normal, like effort turning into exhaustion.